Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to be detectives, basically, launching a psychological investigation into the world of myths. We're going to look for the hidden meanings behind all those ancient stories. The gods, the monsters, the heroes. So let's just dive right in.
Okay, so when you think of a myth, what's the first thing that pops into your head? Is it dragons, epic quests, maybe just some stories you were told as a kid? Yeah, the common assumption is that they're just fairy tales, old, outdated stories, but what if there's something much, much more than that?
So on one hand, you've got the common view, myths are primitive, they're not true, maybe they're for kids. But on the other hand, there's this really profound psychological view. It says that those exact same stories are actually a super sophisticated map of the human mind, that they're the primary language of our unconscious. And that's the big idea we're going to unpack.
So let's start by just getting on the same page about what we're really talking about here. Because in psychology, myths are taken very, very seriously. They aren't seen as some kind of failed attempt at science or logic, but as something absolutely fundamental to who we are.
Psychologists tend to see myth as a symbolic system. Think of it less like an old storybook and more like an operating system for the psyche. It's this deep, symbolic language that organizes everything, from our own personal experiences all the way up to our entire culture.
So, our investigation has to start with the original detective of the mind, Sigmund Freud. He was really one of the first people to look at these ancient stories and see not history, but the hidden gears and levers of the mind at work.
Freud's big idea was that myths are basically the dreams of an entire society. You know how our own dreams can reveal our hidden desires or anxieties in a weird, symbolic way? Well, he believed myths do the exact same thing, but for a whole culture, expressing repressed wishes and even traumas that society couldn't face directly.
So the key thing to get about the Freudian view is that myths are always looking backward. They're like clues or symbolic fingerprints left behind by the past. They point back to the repressed childhood of the entire human species. For Freud, it's all about excavation, digging up what's been buried.
And how does this even happen? Well, Freud said that myths use the same psychological tools our minds use when we dream. For instance, something called condensation packs a ton of different meanings into a single image. Like a monster with many heads might represent a really complex and conflicted family. Then there's displacement, which is when a powerful, maybe forbidden, emotion gets transferred onto a safer, symbolic object.
But okay, this is where our investigation takes a huge turn. Because Freud's own student, Carl Jung, looked at the exact same evidence, and he came to a radically different conclusion. You see, Freud was focused on what he called the personal unconscious. That's your own private vault of memories and repressed stuff. But Jung came along and proposed something way bigger, a collective unconscious. He said this was a deeper, shared layer of the psyche that is inherited by all humans everywhere across all of time.
And this collective unconscious, Jung said, is filled with what he called archetypes. Now, the best way to think about these is like pre-installed software for the human mind. They're not specific pictures, but they are universal patterns, blueprints almost, that shape how we instinctively see the world. Patterns for a hero, a monster, a wise guy.
Let's use a really powerful example to make this concrete: the shadow. This archetype represents all the parts of ourselves that we push down, that we repress, or that we just don't know about. And in myths, this is your dragon. This is your Grendel. It's the villain the hero has to confront. And that battle is really about confronting and integrating a part of yourself that you've disowned.
But it's not all dark and scary. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the archetype of the self. This is the big one. It's the archetype of wholeness, of potential. It's the regulating center of our entire personality. And it represents the ultimate goal of our psychological development, becoming a complete, integrated person.
And these patterns are just everywhere. You've got the anima and animus, which represent the inner masculine or feminine soul image, the wise old man or woman who shows up to offer guidance, the great mother, who can be both nurturing and totally destructive, and the trickster, the agent of chaos who breaks all the rules to bring about change. We see these characters pop up again and again in stories across the globe because, as Jung would argue, they're part of our collective human DNA.
So here it is. This is the absolute crucial difference. Where Freud saw myths as signs pointing back to a past trauma, Jung saw them as symbols, as pointers toward a future possibility. For Jung, myths aren't just about what we've been. They're a map for what we have the potential to become.
Okay, so this brings us to our next key figure, the great Joseph Campbell. What he did was take Jung's huge, sometimes abstract ideas about archetypes, and he distilled them down into one universally recognizable story, the journey of the hero.
Campbell called this the monomyth, or the one myth. He basically discovered that countless stories, from ancient religions to modern movies like Star Wars, follow the exact same fundamental template. And he argued that this template isn't just for entertainment, it's a blueprint for our own personal transformation. And the journey itself is beautifully simple in its structure. It's broken down into 3 main acts. First, the hero has to depart from their ordinary, comfortable world. Second, they face a whole series of trials in a stage of initiation. And finally, if they succeed, they return to their old world, but they are changed, transformed by the experience.
And within those 3 acts are these key moments that really represent psychological milestones. The call to adventure is that inner pull toward change, the road of trials. That's where we confront our personal demons, our shadows. And if we make it through, we bring back the ultimate boon, some kind of new wisdom, and become a master of 2 worlds, able to live in both our inner and outer realities.
Okay, so this has all been a fascinating deep dive into theory, right? But does any of it really matter today? Does it have any relevance for us? The answer is absolutely. These psychological ways of looking at myth are actively used to help people navigate their own lives.
For example, there are therapies like sandplay, where people literally create symbolic worlds in a sandbox to work through unconscious issues without even needing words. And there's narrative therapy, which helps people see the problem-saturated stories they've been telling about themselves, and then helps them reauthor a new, more empowering, personal myth. Now, of course, we have to present a balanced view here. This whole psychological approach is not without its critics, and they have some valid points. One of the biggest critiques is unfalsifiability. I mean, you can't really design a lab experiment to prove or disprove that an archetype exists. There's also a serious charge of cultural bias, that claims of a universal myth might actually just be imposing a Western, often male-centric worldview onto other cultures, and in doing so, erasing what makes their stories unique.
So what's the final verdict from our little investigation here? Well, it seems like myths aren't valuable because they're literally true accounts of history. Their power, their real value, lies in their function. They are powerful, symbolic frameworks, timeless maps for understanding ourselves and for navigating the biggest challenges of just being human.
And really, this brings the whole question right back to you. If these myths are a kind of blueprint for transformation, and if your life is a story that's being written every single day, well, are you the hero of it?